All right, students, hello, how are you? We are going to talk about Reconstruction today. This is American history, SUSLA, College Connect. There will be a test that I'm going to put up on Moodle that I will have instructions on how to download it and how to submit it so that therefore there could be a clear path to turning the test in on time. If you are having connectivity problems, please contact me. I can't fix it if I don't know it's broken, okay? For those of you that it says here I have 5 concurrent viewers, I'll have a link to this recording on Moodle after YouTube has finished processing it. So we started with the Civil War on, I'm trying to remember, was it last week? And there weren't that many people here, and we're going to fix that because we're supposed to be having class meetings at the time that students have been registered for them. So today it's 11 o'clock. Excuse me, my clock says 11:01, so I'm here. All right, you need to be here as well. So let's start with Reconstruction. We know the Civil War ended on April 9th, 1865. And the North won. The South was decimated. I always inform my students that the South there used to be a saying that the North won the war, but the South won the peace, and that was correct because of what happened during Reconstruction and what happened during the Jim Crow period and the lynchings and all those other things. So let's continue here. Okay, the key questions is how do we bring the South back into the Union there? How do we rebuild the South after its destruction during the war? How do we integrate and protect newly emancipated black freedmen? And what branch of government should control the process of construction? One thing I wanted to mention is that there are, okay, so let me check the mail here. Okay, they've been delivered. I know you got them. No more excuses. Okay, if you got any connectivity problems, you need to contact the IT department and you need to do it very quickly. All right, because this is not going to last. Every semester we go through this. All right, and I'm not sure what the textbooks are like. I don't even know if there's any type of link to it, but the test will come from the PowerPoints and the things that I put up on Moodle. So let's move on. Wartime Reconstruction is what we're going to talk about. Now, Lincoln was assassinated on April 14th, 1865, and the gentleman that took over for him was Andrew Johnson. But Lincoln had a plan for bringing the South back into the Union. He wanted to proclaim amnesty and Reconstruction on the 8th of December, 1863, which is actually a little less than 2 years after the war would be over. Replace majority rule with loyal rule in the South. And what does loyal mean? That people that were actually involved in coming back into the nation, they would have to take a loyalty oath to the Union. He didn't consult Congress regarding Reconstruction. He wanted to bring the South back in peacefully without any problems, and this was his 10% plan. Pardon to all but the highest-ranking military and civilian Confederate officers. So lower-ranking staff officers, like colonels, majors, lieutenants, and things of that nature, would get a pardon. Others would not. When 10% of the voting population in the 1860 election had taken an oath of loyalty and established a government, it would be recognized. But their constitutions had to have particular laws in them because they were reestablishing rule. In 1864, there were Lincoln governments in here, Louisiana, Tennessee, and Arkansas. They were loyal to the Union, but they were weak and dependent on the Northern Army for their survival. Later on, there would be what was known as the Military Act, which would actually make the former Southern states governments, but they were run by a military. All right, so we started to see that in around 1867, 1868. But Lincoln wanted to bring the Union back in bring the Confederacy back in very peacefully. In 1864, there was the Wade-Davis bill. Senator Benjamin Wade. We spoke about this in the Civil War presentation. Republican from Ohio, and Congressman Henry W. Davies, Republican from Maryland. Now, let's not forget, yes, there are two parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, okay? The Democrats were mostly Southern, and they were the ones that wanted to keep freed blacks under their thumb. It required 50% of the number of 1860 voters to take an ironclad oath of allegiance, swearing they had never voluntarily aided the rebellion. Required a state constitutional convention before the election of state officials, and enacted specific safeguards of freedmen's liberties. Now, the Wade-Davis bill did not pass, all right? But certain laws like that would be passed, specifically the writing of new constitutions where there were guarantees for the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, and we'll get to those in just a second. And so, this would be like a state suicide conquered provinces position. Philadelphia Congressman Thaddeus Stevens. President Lincoln had a pocket veto, and he vetoed the Wade-Davis bill because that's not what he wanted. He wanted the 10% plan. Jefferson Davis, who was president of the Confederacy, had fled when the war ended and the South surrendered, and actually wore a woman's dress to disguise himself at one time, and he was placed under arrest, but later released. Okay, a lot of them, they probably should have been tried for treason. The 13th Amendment, which is most important, there was a movie that came out a few years back called 13, and it was about this. It was ratified in December of 1865. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Now, I want you to look at the date here, December 1865. And that's why, as an historian, I have to question as to whether the Civil War was actually fought because of slavery. The Union was always touting how they were fighting the war to end slavery. Well, in 1862, December, Frederick Douglass goes to President Abraham Lincoln and says, why don't you get some of these runaway slaves and bring them into the Union Army? Because the Union was losing the war in 1862. So Lincoln says, okay, we'll go ahead and do that. But how do we do it? Well, let's free all the slaves in the states that are at war with the United States. So in January of 1863, Lincoln enacts the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, the Emancipation Proclamation frees all the slaves in the southern states, but slavery still existed in the North. So if slavery still existed in the North, the Union Army could not have been fighting to end slavery. Thus, look at this date. The war ended in April of 1865, and this was ratified in December of 1865. Thank you, Nadia. I appreciate it. Looks like you're the only one, okay, out of like 22 people. So we're going to fix that. I might even give you extra credit. What do you think? So when we see the... Did you have any problems with the link? Okay. So when we see, like, people say, well, they fought to end slavery. Well, if they did, why didn't they end it earlier in the whole nation? Lincoln had the power to do that, but he didn't. He only did it in the southern states. And it took until December, which was 8 months after the war was over, in order to abolish slavery. Okay? So, and I'm going to talk about, no problem. You look like the only one that's here, too. Thank you. The Freedmen's Bureau was set up in Congress to, it was a bureau of refugees, freedmen, and abandoned lands. That's what that was supposed to take care of. And many former Northern abolitionists risked their lives to help Southern freedmen. They were called carpetbaggers by white Southern Democrats. Great. So no, and I sent out a read receipt and a delivery receipt, and people should have been here, but you're the only one here. Okay, so what happens is they have these carpetbaggers, and they're called carpetbaggers because they're coming down here to con Southern people. Is basically what they're doing, and it opened up the way for them. Okay, the South was decimated; their economy was terrible. The Freedmen's Bureau was seen through Southern eyes, plenty to eat and nothing to do. Of course, they opened up schools. They offered loans, low-interest loans for freed blacks and open businesses. See, so when we look at, let me see. I gotta open this up a little bit so we can see it. There we go. Okay, they opened up. They gave money so that they could open up businesses. 11. Okay. All right. I guess, see, there's a live chat on the right, okay? And I can see it, but I don't see, hello, Miss Walida, how you doing? I can't see when people are signed in for some reason. I don't know what the problem is. So y'all didn't, Miss Walker, how you doing? Nice to see you. So y'all had the link, no problem, right? No problem at all. Okay, I'll wait for y'all to answer because this is kind of like there's a delay in here. Is there any news on the textbooks? And you can interrupt me by typing it because I don't want to keep you here as long as we have to be. It's a pretty long type of PowerPoint presentation. Okay, so how whites saw it as it was plenty to eat but nothing to do. And because they weren't going to offer training. So there's been no word on the textbooks whatsoever. No word. Okay, good. Because I know people, they just, I don't know. I don't know if they're ignoring me. We have these problems every semester with people. But that's beside the point. I'm doing what I love to do. Okay, so the Freedmen's Bureau wasn't seen as very popular amongst the white population or Southern Democrats. Now we have presidential Reconstruction. And the reason why we have presidential Reconstruction is because Lincoln was assassinated. Okay? Now, Andrew Jackson was a Jacksonian Democrat. He was anti-aristocratic, but he was also a white supremacist. Okay? And, okay, let's see. Nadia said, there hasn't been any new news, but I realized one of the other instructors inquired and I received the other books immediately. Well, she called me Friday, and I'm going to have to contact her. But our first test is going to be on the PowerPoints that I've already put up, and I'll tell you what they are, and I'll show you. Okay, Miss Jules, and I'll put I'll show you instructions on how to download the test, how to fill it out and then save it because it's a template. Okay, so I'll do it that way. But Andrew Jackson was a Democrat and Lincoln was a Republican. So and Johnson was a white supremacist, and he agreed with Lincoln that states had never legally left the Union. He basically said, "Damn the Negroes! I'm fighting these traitorous aristocrats and their masters." So he was more at war with slaveholders. Okay. So when Johnson got in there, he wanted to punish the South. He didn't want to be nice about it at all. President Johnson's 10% plus plan. Let me see if I could open this up too, because they tend to get kind of small when you. All right, there we go. All right, so his 10% plus plan offered amnesty upon simple oath to all except the Confederate civil and military officers and those with property over $20,000. They could apply directly to Johnson. Now, doubted if anybody in the South had $20,000 that they could apply to, worth of property that they could apply to Johnson directly for amnesty. In new constitutions, they must accept minimum conditions repudiating slavery, secession, and state debts. All right, so what Johnson wants is he wants to repudiate slavery. Even though he's a white supremacist, he wants to punish the slaveholders. All right. He named provisional governors in the Confederate states and called them to oversee elections for constitutional conventions. The states would not be allowed back in unless they wrote a new state constitution, which Louisiana did in 1864, because we were occupied by the Union Army from 1862 onward, most of the state anyway. New Orleans was. And the effects of it, of his plan, was it disenfranchised certain leading Confederates. Now, let me explain what disenfranchisement means. That means you're not allowed to vote. All right? The 13th Amendment was passed in December 1865, so Congress is going to have to do something in order to demonstrate that they were on the side of freed blacks. Well, the Freedmen Bureau was set up. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment would come a few years later, and what that did was it granted freed slaves citizenship. They were not considered American citizens, even though the bulk of them, 95% were born here in the United States. The slave trade was kind of cut off from Africa in the early 19th century, but there were still people who were smuggling them in. The 15th Amendment would grant them the right to vote. Now, here's the problem, and we're going to see this later on in the presentation, is that the South ignored Congress's laws. They just totally ignored them. And then we start to see the emergence of Jim Crow, all right? And we'll talk about that a little bit later. They said slavery was dead in the South, but it kind of went on in other forms, like sharecropping and crop liens, where there was debt slavery. All right, there wouldn't actually be any equal rights until much later, or a government that would fight for them. The growing Northern alarm about whether the Southern states were going to do what Johnson wanted them to do. Many Southern state constitutions fell short of the minimum requirements, and Johnson granted 13,500 special pardons. And there was a revival of Southern defiance, and Northern people believed that there was going to be another civil war, that the South was going to break away again. Well, the South, a lot of the former Confederate states formed what they call black codes. And these codes went along with what was known, in Louisiana, we have what was called the Code Noir, which was basically black codes, which basically informed freed blacks where they could go, who they could associate with. They couldn't carry weapons. They had to be home at a certain time. Well, this does not signify that they're free, especially in the South. And that's what the Congress was banking on, is that they would basically take their freedom and they would do things with it. And they weren't allowed to do it because these black codes came into effect. Later on, we'll see that the Republicans who were in Congress, who actually got the 13th Amendment passed, had ignored the former slaves later on and went after the Indians in the West. And we're going to talk about that a little bit later. The black codes, the purposes were guaranteed stable labor supply now that the blacks were emancipated, which means that they're free, they can't leave the land, all right? Restore pre-emancipation system of race relations. Let's go back to the antebellum days, is what the Southern Democrats want. They know their place, and that's it. All right? They're not going to get any more rights. They're stuck down here. We lost the war. And, of course, the South, the Confederacy, blamed the slaves for losing the war. Forced many blacks to become sharecroppers, tenant farmers. And what that meant was they were tied to the land because they couldn't leave. And I'll explain this very as succinctly as I can. When slavery was abolished, a lot of slaves were uneducated. So they couldn't go anywhere because they didn't have an education. Some of them left to look for family members that had been sold into slavery earlier. But a lot of them were tied to the land. So when they were tied to the land, the landholders, who were rich white people, basically said, okay, if we're not going to have legal slavery, then we're going to have debt slavery. And that's where sharecropping comes in, and that's where crop lien systems come in. And I'll give you an example. Okay, you are a sharecropper, and the landholder that you used to work for as a slave says, okay, I'm going to give you this plot of land, and I want to take 60% of what you make in produce, and I'm going to take that money and I'm going to use it as your rent. Well, what happens is the crops fail. There's not as much as people hoped. And the sharecroppers keep going into debt and keep going into debt and keep going into debt until finally they're still tied to the land, but they're tied to the land based upon the debt that they owe, rather than just in the servitude that they owe. If you don't understand it, please ask me a question. It's not that hard to understand because they're still tied to the land. They're free, allegedly, because of the 13th Amendment, because it abolished slavery. But they're still tied to the land because of the debt that they owe. And the white landowners were not going to let them go without paying the debt. So basically, they became slaves again on the same land in most cases. All right? Okay. Congress breaks with the president. They don't agree with him, and Congress was Republican. And the president was a Democrat. He was a Southern Democrat. Congress bars Southern congressional delegates from coming into Congress. These representatives from the South could not go into Congress and vote on anything until their states, who they represent, had written the proper state constitutions with the minimum requirements on slavery. See? There was a joint committee on Reconstruction created, and in February 1866, President vetoed the Freedmen's Bureau bill. Now, like most programs that are organized by the government, I'm sure some of you may agree, it wasn't funded properly. There wasn't a lot of money in it. Congress passed both bills over Johnson's vetoes in this is the first in history where you need a 2/3 majority in both houses to override the president's veto. The bill starts in the House, goes to the Senate, then it goes to the president. The president can either approve it or he can veto it, which means it doesn't go into effect. But both houses of Congress overrode Johnson's veto and made it a law. So the Freedmen's Bureau bill was made into a law. Johnson the Martyr, Samson. This is something that came from an article where it says, if my blood be shed because I vindicate the Union, and, well, yeah, maybe not all of it, but most of it. If my blood is to be shed because I vindicate the Union and the preservation of this government in its original purity and character, let it be shed. Let an altar to the Union be erected, and then, if it is necessary, take me and lay me upon it. And the blood that now warms and animates my existence shall be poured out as a fit libation of the Union. Okay, let me clarify something for you. Yes, some of this stuff will be on a test, but if you download them, and I'm not advocating you do this, you'll be able to answer the questions. All it is reading and filling it out. There's no study guides. All you have to do is look at it. You can pay attention. You can take notes. I will basically show you what's going to be on the test. And when I put it up, you fill it out and you send it back and I grade it. It's that simple. Okay? So yes, it is going to be on the test. All right. Radical Reconstruction. This is where it starts getting really, really nasty, because the South is not paying attention. All right, 14th Amendment. Ratified in July of 1868. Okay, so this is 3 years after the end of the Civil War. Provided a constitutional guarantee of rights and security of freed people, ensured against neo-Confederate political power, and enshrined the national debt while repudiating that of the Confederacy. So the Confederacy did not have a debt. Southern states would be punished for denying the right to vote to blacks. So basically with the 14th Amendment, there was a granted citizenship. And why did they do that? 1857, there was a court case called the Dred Scott case. In that case, what happened was Dred Scott was a slave, and his slaveholder was a military officer, and they went from a slave territory into a free state. And therefore, Dred Scott says, well, now that I'm here, I'm free. And so he sued for his freedom. The case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and Roger B. Taney, who was a Southerner, stated, you can't sue because you don't have any rights because you're not a citizen, even though Dred Scott had been born here. So the 14th Amendment was passed to remedy that, making all freed blacks citizens of the United States. The balance of power, if you look at the balance of power in each of the southern states, you're going to notice that in some of them, the freed slaves outnumber white citizens a lot. Now, this didn't necessarily mean that there was going to be any type of insurrection, but Southerners believe that. They put it into the people's heads that there's going to be a freedman's insurrection, and that's why we see Jim Crow come about. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay, the 1866 by-election was a referendum on radical Reconstruction. Johnson made an ill-conceived propaganda tour around the country to push the plan. Something should tell you, especially back then, if he was pushing a plan that was really not going to be equal, it wasn't going to work and it wasn't going to be any good. Republicans won a 3-1 majority in both houses and gained the control of every northern state. So now the Republicans control Congress, and they're going to start passing laws that are going to punish the South rather than help it back into the Union. This was the radical Reconstruction plan for readmission. And that is, civil authorities in the territories were subject to military supervision, which means that even if you elect a Confederate government, there's military supervision over it. Required state constitutions, again, including black suffrage and ratification of the 13th and 14th Amendments. So black suffrage is basically the right to vote. That's what it is. It's the right to vote. So when you get the right to vote, you know, if you want to come back into the Union, you have to give freed blacks the right to vote. In March 1867, Congress passed an act that authorized the military to enroll eligible black voters and begin the process of constitution making. All right, so now Congress says, okay, you have to start enrolling black voters on the voter rolls in order for them to vote. Well, what's going to happen if you have a bunch of former Confederate officers, not necessarily generals, that are running for a particular office and they don't like freed blacks? You got to keep them from going into the voting booths. Okay, let's see here. All right. The Reconstruction Acts of the Military Reconstruction Act restart Reconstruction in the 10 southern states that refused to ratify the 14th Amendment, giving freed blacks citizenship. Divided the 10 unreconstructed states into 5 military districts. We were in the 5th military district. I believe Philip Sheridan was the governor. So what's going on is Congress is undermining the president's plans, Andrew Johnson, and he doesn't like it very much. Now, the Reconstruction Acts of 1867, I'm not going to hold you to knowing all of these by heart, okay, because you're not really going to have to. The president must issue all Reconstruction orders through the commander of the military. Tenure of Office Act. The president could not remove any officials without the Senate's consent if the position originally required Senate approval, which means, like, you know, a lot of positions now, President Trump nominates somebody. Well, they have to get the Senate to approve them in order for them to take office, and that's what this is about. It was designed to protect radical members of Lincoln's government, and there was a question of the constitutionality of this law. President Johnson went against the law. He removed Edwin M. Stanton. Let me go back to the last picture. That's Edwin Stanton. He was Lincoln's Secretary of War, and he passed on to the next administration. So he was also Andrew Johnson's Secretary of War, and he and Johnson didn't get along, so he removed him. Johnson replaced generals in the field who were more sympathetic to the radical side of Reconstruction, and the House impeached him on February 24th before even drawing up the charges by a vote of 126 to 47. Now, A lot of people don't know what impeachment means. Impeachment is only an indictment. All right? Either they found enough evidence or they didn't. That's their right. If they the House votes for impeachment, then it goes to the Senate for a trial. That's where the trial takes place. So they impeached Johnson. Now, that doesn't mean he still rules. Until he is removed from office, he still, rules the country. Well, as in the office of president, anyway. So they didn't even come up with any charges. And they still impeached him. Now, he goes up for trial later, and it's an 11-week trial, and he's acquitted 35-19, one short of the 2/3 vote. So he's not convicted. So he's not impeached. So he's still in office. Black adjustment in the South. If we look here, we can see this map where you're looking at a percentage of sharecropper farms. If you look in Texas and all out through Alabama, South Carolina, North Carolina, there's more farms than there is actually urban areas. And they were stuck to the land. Again, they were tied to this debt slavery. This is a comparison of sharecropping and the crop lien system, all right? So let's go straight across like this, okay? Because then we have the arrows pointing and they show you exactly where they go. They go. The crop lien system was another way of debt slavery. It was another reason for debt slavery. It was another way to have debt slavery. Furnishing merchant loan tools and seed up to 50-60% to tenant farmer to plant the spring crop. Okay, so the tenant farmer, the freed blacks, they plant the crop, okay? And they loan them the tools and they loan them the seeds up to 60% off of what they produce. They plant the crops and they harvest them in the autumn. Well, the landowner decides that he's going to rent the land to the tenant farmer in exchange for 1/4 to 1/2 of the tenant farmer's future crop. So, for instance, if you have a bad crop, you still owe that money. And then you go deeper in debt because then you have to put that on credit. You have to put your rent on credit with the landholder. So what happens there? I'm going to ask you a question. What happens? If you have to keep planting crops and you're not making any money, what happens? I'm making sure y'all are awake out there. If you have to keep planting crops, what happens to your credit? Back then. Don't worry about what now, back then. All right, so it looks like y'all are asleep. Okay, you go further into debt. And then, again, you're still further tied to the land. You can't go anywhere. Farmer also secures food, clothing, and other necessities on credit from the merchant until the harvest. Turns up to half of the crop to the landowner as payment for rent. The tenant gives the remainder of the crop to the merchant in payment of debt. But he still may be in debt. So the merchant holds a lien, which is a mortgage, on part of the tenant's future crops as a repayment of the debt. Again, now this is not exactly. Thank you, Nadia. Glad you're paying attention. That's 5 extra points on your test. Let's see if that wakes people up. You have this crop lien system, and you also have the sharecropping as a tenant farmer, and it just further ties blacks to the land. So when I said earlier that the North won the war, but the South won the peace, they still kept the freed blacks in bondage through debt rather than in physical bondage. But then again, it still is physical bondage because you have to work on that farm. Black and white political participation. If you look at this, you'll notice that there was a lot of blacks tried to participate in. Yes, you did. You wrote that. Blacks tried to participate in the government, but they weren't allowed to in the southern states. So there's more white participation. So basically, a lot of the laws that the whites came up with that the whites came up with, those would get made into laws. And they were both basically suppression of freed blacks. So then you have Jim Crow. Jim Crow is what we knew before as de facto, which means it's accepted. But then it became de jure, which means by law. Okay, so Jim Crow laws go into effect in the 1880s and 1890s. The establishment of historic black colleges took place. We start to see Booker T. Washington later in the late 19th century form the Tuskegee Institute. And then we start to see these other black colleges all over the place that come up, historically black colleges. SUNO and SUSLA are one of those, along with Xavier, I think Xavier, and Dillard. Those are historically black colleges, and there's other ones up in the north. I believe Emory started off as one too. So you start to see black colleges. So what's going on is there are people in the mainstream that are advocates for freed blacks, okay? And they start these universities in more progressive states, mostly northern states. And then in some southern states, especially like in Louisiana, we had a black lieutenant governor by the name of PBS Pinchback, but he died in office. So, but there were blacks being elected to state legislatures and trying to make some laws. But it's kind of like you're a hen in a fox house. Basically, you turn it around. You're looking at these people and they're going, why are you here? How did you get elected, and things of that nature. So that's what happened. Blacks in Southern politics, core voters were black veterans who had fought either on the Union side or the Confederate side. Yes, the Confederacy did have some black troops fighting. Blacks were politically unprepared. They didn't know how politics worked. And blacks could register and vote in states since 1867. The 15th Amendment guaranteed them the right to vote. But what is it I related earlier is that Southern states ignored Northern laws. The 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870. The rights of the citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Granted former slaves the right to vote. Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Women's rights groups were furious that they were not granted the vote. Women would not get the right to vote until 1920. So, and a lot of them actually helped with the war effort. We saw a lot of Confederate spies and women that were nurses and things of that nature. But women were actually angry because they did not get the right to vote. We start to see the formation of what's known as the Invisible Empire of the South. In 1867, in Pulaski, Tennessee, there was a former Confederate general by the name of Nathan Bedford Forrest. And Nathan Bedford Forrest wanted to form a social club for former Confederate veterans. And he wanted to give it a name that would denote a circle. And so he looked up the Greek word, they looked up the Greek word for circle, which was kuklos. So they decided to name their organization the Ku Klux Klan in 1867. It was supposed to be a social club. Later on, they started taking on the persona of being the ghosts of Confederate veterans and seeking revenge on the freed black population. And that's when Louisiana, we had a group called the Knights of the White Camellia. Like Washington Parish and all of those, and they were basically going and burning crosses. They were taking people out and lynching them. They were keeping them from voting. So we start to see this, and this is like a thorn in my claw here, because I didn't see the necessity of groups like this. I really didn't. It's extra legal violence. We start to see lynchings go up, and we start to see these Jim Crow laws come into effect. And I'm going to explain a little bit more about those as we get into the Jim Crow laws. The failure of federal enforcement. There was an Enforcement Act of 1870 and 71, also known as the KKK Act, and it recognized the South's lost cause. Because we went to war and we lost the war, it was a lost cause. And we start to see the rise of a rural type of movement called the Bourbons, and the Redeemers were pre-war Democrats and Union Whigs. So now you have people who were Unionists, who lived in the South, were born in the South, and we referred to them as scalawags. And then you have the carpetbaggers coming in. And now you have a little group rising called the Bourbons, and they were Democrats mostly. And they, you know, if you were a Democrat in Louisiana, you had it made, because, freed blacks were not going to register as Democrats. You're against your own type of demise. I mean, they were the ones that formed the KKK and a lot of these white supremacy groups, and they were against the rights that were passed by Congress, the rights of citizenship and things of that nature. Congress saw a problem, and they passed the Civil Rights Act of 1875. It was a crime for any individual to deny full and equal use of public conveyances and public places. It prohibited discrimination in jury selection, and it lacked a strong enforcement mechanism, and there was no new Civil Rights Act attempted for 90 years. So we didn't see anything until like 1964. What does that mean? Well, that means that basically, the Republican Congress makes a law in 1875 that makes it a crime for any individual to deny full and equal use of public places and public conveyances. Well, here's my question. Who's going to arrest them? If your local governments are run by the Democrats, it's not going to happen. So a lot of these laws that were going through were not only ignored, but there was no way to enforce them. The Grant administration came in 1868. Ulysses S. Grant was a Union general, and I don't want to go over. So when I get to 50 minutes, I think I'm going to call it a lecture, and I'll put the rest of the lecture up on Moodle. The Grant administration came in. Now, Grant was the last general that actually beat Robert E. Lee. This is President Grant, and Schuyler Colfax was his vice president. Grant had one of the most corrupt administrations in American history, and he made money for his friends. He didn't really pay attention to a lot of political things. He was more of a military man, and he was a Republican, actually, when he became president. The Democratic ticket had Horatio Seymour and a general by the name of Frank Pereira from Missouri. And the Democrats were mostly the northern Democrats. There weren't any southern Democrats really on that ticket at the time. And the Republican Southern strategy was waving the bloody shirt, which was trying to make the South guilty that they had caused so many deaths during the Civil War. It didn't work. Okay? In the 1868 presidential election, Grant won by, had a lot of the popular vote and won the electoral vote 214 to what is that? 214 electoral vote? Okay, 214 to 80 over the Democrats. It was kind of obvious that if Grant was going to get elected, the South was going to do what they wanted anyway, and so they did. President Ulysses S. Grant wrote his memoirs, and in 1885, he was dying of throat cancer. He was a heavy smoker and a heavy drinker. He smoked cigars. And he had actually lost his family's fortune because he lent his name to a stock firm in New York, and before his death, he was broke. And when he wrote the book, it restored his family's wealth. Not a very productive administration, especially when you're talking about during Reconstruction. Grant's administration scandals. Grant presided over an era of unprecedented growth and corruption. There was the Credit Mobilier scandal, which is granting credit to people who didn't deserve it and eventually getting people in debt. There was the whiskey ring, and there was the Indian ring. I'll set some links up so you can see what those are. there was people in power in New York City, a guy by the name of Boss Tweed, and you had to vote for him or else. And there was Thomas Nast, who was a crusading cartoonist and reporter, and you see right there the cartoon that he drew. Boss Tweed had people voting for him illegally in New York City, and they set up these types of administrations that were very corrupt. They dealt in a lot of graft. They were getting bribed and things of that nature. And they want to know who stole the people's money. Now, I only got a few more slides here, and I don't want to keep you past the time. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to end the lecture here, and I'll put the PowerPoint and this lecture up. Again, since we don't have any line on what's going on with the textbooks, the test is going to be mostly from the two PowerPoints that I put up, one on the Civil War and one on Reconstruction. And I'm going to probably put the test up either Friday or either Thursday or Friday, depends on when I have time. And I'm going to show you how to download it and then fill it out and then send it back to me on time. You're going to have 4 days to do this. So I don't want people saying, oh, I forgot. All right? Because what I might do is send out reminders to let you know it's due by this time. It has to be in by this time. You have to do it. Okay? So I want to thank everybody for coming to the live stream. We are going to have class Monday. It's going to be live streams from now on at 11 o'clock. Hopefully we can get some more people to show up. And I will speak to you soon. Just look in your emails. Look for the test as it's put up. It's probably going to be in a Word template. And all you're going to have to do is fill in the answers and send it back. Okay? So I will see you soon. Thanks, everyone, for coming. And